Long before the world heard the word apartheid, South Africa was already a land divided. In the early 20th century, its rolling plains and gold-rich cities were home to people of many colors and cultures: Africans, Europeans, Indians, and people of mixed descent. But power rested firmly in the hands of a small white minority. When the Union of South Africa was formed in 1910, black South Africans, who made up the majority, were denied the right to vote. Laws determined where they could live, work, and even walk. They were forced to carry passes showing permission to be in white areas. Schools, hospitals, and jobs were not equal and were never meant to be. In 1948, after decades of inequality, a new government came to power, the National Party. It promised to make segregation permanent. Its leaders used a single word to describe their vision: apartheid, an Afrikaans word meaning apartness. Under apartheid, people were classified into rigid racial categories: white, black, colored, and Indian. Families were torn apart because of these labels. Mixed marriages were banned. Neighborhoods that had existed for generations were bulldozed to make way for white-only areas. Black South Africans were pushed into distant lands called homelands, far from the cities and their jobs. It was a system built not only on prejudice, but on control, political, social, and economic. And yet, even in those early years, voices of resistance began to rise. In 1912, decades before apartheid officially began, a group of African leaders met in Bloemfontein. They formed the African National Congress, the ANC, an organization that would one day lead the struggle for freedom. At first, the ANC tried peaceful methods: petitions, letters, and negotiations. They believed that reason and justice could persuade those in power to change. But as the years passed, the laws only grew harsher. In 1952, the Defiance Campaign was launched. Thousands of black South Africans refused to obey unjust laws. They entered white-only train stations, sat on park benches marked Europeans Only, and marched without permits. They were arrested by the hundreds, but their courage inspired millions. Among those young activists was a tall, determined lawyer from the countryside, Nelson Mandela. He believed that South Africa could belong to everyone who lived in it, regardless of race or color. Alongside leaders like Walter Sisulu, Oliver Tambo, and Albertina Sisulu, Mandela became one of the faces of a growing movement for equality. In 1955, the ANC and its allies gathered in Kliptown to write the Freedom Charter, a bold document declaring South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. But the government saw this as a threat. Meetings were raided, leaders arrested, and movements banned. Still, the fire of resistance could not be extinguished. The stage was being set for a struggle that would last for decades, a struggle that would test the courage of an entire nation. Every part of daily life, from where a person could live to what bus they could ride, was determined by race. The walls of segregation were rising higher each year. But so was the spirit of resistance. In towns and villages across the country, protests began to grow. Ordinary people, teachers, factory workers, mothers, and students found courage in unity. They organized boycotts of white-owned stores. They marched through dusty streets, singing freedom songs that echoed across the land. But for the apartheid government, these voices of defiance were seen as threats. The police were given more power. Meetings were broken up with batons and bullets. Laws were passed to silence dissent. In 1956, 156 leaders of the freedom movement, including Nelson Mandela, were arrested in what became known as the treason trial. They were accused of plotting to overthrow the government. For 4 long years, the trial dragged on. But in the end, all were acquitted. Even though they were free, the message from the government was clear. Opposition would not be tolerated. And soon, the struggle would turn darker and more violent. On March 21, 1960, a peaceful protest took place in the township of Sharpeville. Men and women gathered to demonstrate against the hated pass laws, those small identity books that controlled where Black South Africans could go. They came unarmed, smiling, holding up their passes for the police to see. But what happened next would shock the world. As the crowd swelled, police panicked. Without warning, they opened fire. Bullets tore through the crowd. 69 people were killed. More than 180 were wounded. Most were shot in the back as they tried to run. The Sharpeville massacre changed everything. Around the world, people began to see the true brutality of apartheid. The South African government declared a state of emergency. Thousands were arrested. The ANC and other organizations were banned. Inside the movement, despair turned to determination. Many activists began to believe that peaceful protest was no longer enough. In 1961, Nelson Mandela helped form Umkhonto we Sizwe, the Spear of the Nation, the armed wing of the ANC. It marked a turning point. The struggle would now include sabotage against government buildings, power stations, and military targets, carefully planned to avoid loss of life. Mandela went underground, moving from safe house to safe house, organizing in secret. He became known as the Black Pimpernel for his ability to evade capture. But the apartheid police were relentless. In 1962, Mandela was arrested. He was accused of leaving the country without permission and inciting workers' strikes. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison. While serving that sentence, police raided a farmhouse in Rivonia, a secret ANC hideout. There they found documents outlining plans for sabotage. This led to the Rivonia trial of 1963-64, one of the most famous trials in history. Mandela and his comrades stood in the dock, accused of treason and conspiracy. When asked to speak, Mandela delivered words that would echo across the world. "I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." On June 12, 1964, Nelson Mandela and 7 others were sentenced to life imprisonment. He was sent to Robben Island, a small, harsh prison off the coast of Cape Town. The leaders of the freedom movement were behind bars. The government believed the resistance had been crushed. But they were wrong, because even from prison, Mandela's spirit and the spirit of the people would continue to grow. A fire once lit cannot be easily extinguished. For Nelson Mandela and his comrades, Robben Island was meant to be the end, a place of silence, isolation, and punishment. But instead, it became a university of revolution. The island lay just off the coast of Cape Town, a world away from freedom. Cold winds swept across the stone quarries where prisoners were forced to work long hours under the blazing sun. They were given thin uniforms, poor food, and almost no contact with their families. Letters arrived only a few times a year, heavily censored, with whole lines blacked out by guards. Yet within those prison walls, something remarkable happened. The prisoners began to teach one another politics, philosophy, law, and leadership. They debated the meaning of justice, the future of their nation, and how to keep hope alive. Mandela, though behind bars, became a leader still. He guided younger inmates, resolved disputes, and taught that dignity could not be taken unless one surrendered it. He said, "The authorities can imprison my body, but my mind and my ideals will remain free." Outside, the government tried to erase him from history. His image was banned. His name could not be spoken publicly. But instead, his legend grew. While Mandela endured life on the island, the movement outside South Africa changed shape. Many ANC leaders fled into exile to Tanzania, Zambia, and other African nations that had gained independence. From abroad, they built networks, trained volunteers, and called on the world to act. The fight against apartheid was no longer confined within South Africa's borders. It had become a global cause. Students in London, New York, and Lagos marched through the streets demanding Mandela's release. Musicians and artists raised their voices, using songs, plays, and paintings to call out injustice. The cry of Free Nelson Mandela began to echo around the world. But inside South Africa, resistance did not stop either. A new generation, born under apartheid, raised in its shadow, was coming of age. In the 1970s, the Black consciousness movement, led by Steve Biko, inspired young people to reclaim their pride and identity. Black is beautiful, they declared, not as vanity, but as defiance. Biko's message was simple: liberation begins in the mind. But the government feared even ideas. In 1977, Steve Biko was arrested, beaten, and killed in police custody. His death sent shockwaves across the country. It showed once again how brutal the apartheid regime could be. The 1970s were years of darkness, but also of awakening. The world was watching more closely now. In the United Nations, countries began to impose sanctions and arms embargoes on South Africa. Sports teams refused to play against South African clubs. Companies pulled their investments, refusing to profit from apartheid. The pressure was growing, slowly, steadily. But inside South Africa, repression only intensified. New laws censored the press, banned political gatherings, and imprisoned activists without trial. Yet even as the government tried to tighten its grip, its power began to slip. Because the movement had spread too far, into every township, every home, every heart that still dared to dream. And far away, on a small island surrounded by cold waves and barbed wire, Nelson Mandela and his fellow prisoners could feel it. They knew change was coming. Maybe not soon, but certainly. They waited. They endured. They believed. Mandela later said, "It always seems impossible until it's done." By the mid-1970s, the cracks in apartheid were beginning to show. The prisons were full, but the spirit of resistance had not been broken. In the dusty streets of Soweto, a sprawling township outside Johannesburg, a new voice was rising, the voice of the youth. Many of them had never known freedom, They had grown up in crowded homes with poor schools and little hope for jobs. And yet, they had something the regime could never control: courage. In 1976, the government announced that all black students would be forced to learn certain subjects in Afrikaans, the language of their oppressors. To the students, it felt like one more way to silence them. So they decided to speak by refusing to obey. On the morning of June 16, 1976, thousands of school children marched through Soweto's streets carrying signs and singing songs of freedom. They were dressed in uniforms, some with backpacks still slung over their shoulders. They were peaceful. They wanted only to be heard. But when the police arrived, armed with guns and tear gas, fear turned into tragedy. The officers opened fire on the children. Panic spread. A 13-year-old boy named Hector Peterson was shot and killed. A photograph of his body, carried by another student through the streets, became one of the most powerful images of the 20th century. It showed the world what apartheid truly meant. That day, hundreds of students were killed or wounded. But the uprising did not die there. It spread across the nation, from township to township, city to city. For the first time, the regime faced not just protest, but defiance from the very children it tried to control. The Soweto Uprising marked a turning point. The government tried to crush it with violence, arresting thousands. But something had changed forever. The world could no longer look away. Images of the protests appeared on televisions and newspapers everywhere. People began to ask, how long can this last? By the early 1980s, resistance had become part of everyday life. Trade unions formed secret networks. Church leaders spoke out from the pulpits. Underground newspapers spread stories of struggle and survival. Meanwhile, in exile, the African National Congress and its allies launched international campaigns calling for boycotts, sanctions, and the isolation of South Africa from the global stage. The apartheid government found itself surrounded, morally and politically. Inside the country, the tension grew unbearable. Tear gas filled the streets of Johannesburg and Cape Town. Night raids became common. Entire families disappeared overnight. But amid the fear, there was also unity. Ordinary citizens, black, white, Indian, and colored, began to find each other. Some white South Africans, too, joined the cause, realizing that justice could no longer be denied. The world was changing, and with it, the balance of power. In 1985, major banks and investors began to pull their money out of South Africa. The United Nations increased sanctions, and global celebrities joined the call for change. Concerts like Artists Against Apartheid brought millions together through music and hope. The cry of "Free Nelson Mandela" grew louder, a song, a slogan, a symbol of resistance. By the late 1980s, South Africa was feeling the strain. Its economy was collapsing. Its allies were turning away. And its people, once divided by fear, were now united by one dream: freedom. Even inside prison, Mandela could feel it. The guards treated him with a new kind of respect. Foreign leaders began to visit, asking questions, seeking negotiations. The world's eyes were on one man and on one country, standing at the edge of transformation. The uprising that began with school children's songs had turned into a movement that could no longer be silenced. The tide had turned. By the early 1990s, South Africa was standing at a crossroads. The walls of apartheid were beginning to crumble, not with explosions, but with conversations. For the first time in history, the government and the freedom fighters sat across from each other at the same table. The man leading the talks for the government was President F.W. de Klerk, and across from him sat Nelson Mandela, who had walked out of prison only a short while ago, older, calmer, and wiser than ever. The meeting was tense. The air was thick with mistrust. For decades, they had seen each other as enemies, one enforcing the laws of segregation, the other fighting to destroy them. But both men knew that the country could not survive another day of bloodshed. Mandela's words were gentle but firm. We must forget our differences and build one nation. South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. The talks, known as CODESA, Convention for a Democratic South Africa, began in 1991. Representatives from political groups, community leaders, and even former enemies came together. They debated for months about how to rebuild a nation torn by hate. Outside the conference rooms, however, the country was still burning. Rival political groups clashed in townships. Extremists from both sides attacked civilians, hoping to sabotage peace. Many feared the talks would collapse under the weight of violence. But Mandela refused to give up. He traveled across the country, meeting angry crowds, calming tensions, and reminding them that peace was worth the pain. Courage, he said, is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. Even de Klerk, once a defender of apartheid, began to see the truth. The system he had inherited was collapsing. He had two choices: resist and see the country drown in chaos, or work with Mandela to build something new. He chose the second path. The world watched in cautious hope. Reporters from every corner of the globe filled Johannesburg and Cape Town, waiting to see if South Africa could perform what many called the miracle of peace. But peace did not come easily. There were bombings, assassinations, and riots. At times it felt like the dream of democracy would die before it was born. Yet through it all, Mandela remained a pillar of calm strength. Even his opponents began to respect his resolve. After years of talks, walkouts, and restarts, the impossible happened. In 1993, Mandela and de Klerk signed an agreement to hold South Africa's first multiracial democratic elections. They even shared the Nobel Peace Prize that year, standing side by side as symbols of reconciliation. It was a sight no one thought they'd ever see. The last president of apartheid and the first president of a free South Africa, together, shaking hands before the world. As 1994 approached, a new kind of energy filled the air. The date was set, April 27, 1994, the day South Africa would finally vote as one nation. It was called Freedom Day, a date that would be remembered forever. For months, volunteers went door to door registering millions of first-time voters. For many, it was their first time being treated as equal citizens. Some could barely believe it. "I never thought I would see this day," said one old woman, holding her voter card as if it were gold. Posters of the African National Congress and Mandela's smiling face covered walls and street poles. Children sang songs of freedom in schools. Churches prayed for peace. And across the nation, people whispered a new word with pride: democracy. But the road to the elections was still dangerous. Extremist groups tried to derail the process with violence. Car bombs exploded in Johannesburg. Political assassinations threatened to tear the fragile peace apart. Still, Mandela urged calm. He went on television, addressing the entire nation with steady eyes and a peaceful voice. Let us stand together. Let us prove to the world that we can rise above fear and hate. When the voting finally began, the world held its breath. Helicopters hovered above. International observers watched closely. And yet what they saw was not chaos. It was hope. Long lines stretched from polling stations, winding around buildings and down dusty roads. Some waited all day, others slept in lines overnight. But no one left. People sang freedom songs, waved the new multicolored South African flag, and smiled through tears. For many, this was more than an election. It was the end of humiliation and the beginning of belonging. Days later, the results were announced. The African National Congress had won by a vast majority, and Nelson Mandela, the man who once broke rocks on Robben Island, was declared President of the Republic of South Africa. Crowds erupted in joy. Fireworks lit the sky. Church bells rang. People hugged strangers in the streets, and across the world, leaders called it a victory not just for South Africa, but for humanity itself. After centuries of division and decades of struggle, the dream of a free South Africa had finally come true. Mandela stood before the world, smiling humbly as he said, "Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure." It was a moment that defined a generation, a moment when the impossible became possible, and a new chapter began for a wounded yet unbroken nation. May 10th, 1994. A soft morning sun rose over Pretoria Adium. The air was still, almost sacred, as if the land itself was holding its breath. At the Union buildings, a sea of faces gathered, black, white, Indian, colored, people who had once been divided by law, now standing side by side under a single flag. The flags of the old apartheid regime had been lowered. In their place, a new banner fluttered, bold, bright, and full of meaning, the flag of a new South Africa. As the trumpet sounded, Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela walked to the podium. He was 75 years old, yet he carried himself with the dignity and calm of a man who had already conquered time. Before him sat kings, presidents, and dignitaries from around the world. Above him flew fighter jets in a salute, once symbols of oppression, now guardians of democracy. And around him stood millions of South Africans, tears glistening in their eyes. Mandela placed his hand on the Constitution and took the oath of office as the first black president of South Africa. The crowd erupted in cheers. Some danced, others simply wept. Then, in a steady voice that would echo through history, he said, "Never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another." It was not just a speech, it was a promise a promise to heal the wounds of the past without hatred, a promise to unite the nation without revenge, a promise to begin again. The years that followed were not easy. Apartheid had left behind deep scars, poverty, inequality, and mistrust. Entire communities were broken. Education and healthcare systems were in ruins, and the economy, though rich in resources, was still divided along racial lines. But Mandela knew that freedom meant more than just casting a vote. It meant rebuilding hearts, homes, and hope. He called his vision the Rainbow Nation, a South Africa where every color, every culture, every language had a place. To heal the wounds of the past, Mandela created the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Its purpose was not to punish, but to confront the truth, openly and honestly. Victims told their stories, former soldiers confessed their crimes, families wept, embraced, forgave. It was painful, raw, and emotional, but it allowed a nation to breathe again. Mandela often said, "Courageous people do not fear forgiving for the sake of peace." In sports, too, Mandela found a bridge. When South Africa hosted the 1995 Rugby World Cup, he wore the green jersey, once a symbol of white dominance, and handed the trophy to the captain, Francois Pienaar, saying, "One team, one country." That moment, broadcast worldwide, showed the world what reconciliation looked like. It was not just about politics, it was about humanity. As the years passed, Mandela became more than a leader. He became a symbol of peace, forgiveness, and dignity. When he stepped down after one term, he said, "I have walked that long road to freedom. I have tried not to falter. I have made missteps along the way." But for millions around the world, he had become proof that change, even the most impossible kind, is possible. His presidency marked not just the end of apartheid, but the rebirth of a nation, a place where children of every color could learn together, where women could vote, speak, and lead, where hope could finally replace fear. Yet Mandela's journey also left behind a reminder that freedom is fragile and justice must always be guarded. South Africa's challenges did not vanish. Inequality and corruption still threatened its dream, but the foundation had been laid, a foundation built on sacrifice, courage, and truth. The story of apartheid's end is not just a South African story. It is a story of what humanity can achieve when forgiveness triumphs over revenge, when dialogue replaces violence, and when one man's vision inspires an entire world to believe again. Mandela's life reminds us that peace is not born from power. It is born from understanding. He once said, "No one is born hating another person because of the color of his skin. People must learn to hate, and if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love." Today, South Africa still walks that long road, a road towards equality, dignity, and justice for all. But every step it takes is built upon the legacy of those who refuse to give up. Because the end of apartheid was not just the end of a system, it was the beginning of hope. And as long as the world remembers, as long as freedom remains a flame in every heart, the dream that Nelson Mandela lived for will never die. This was the story of the end of apartheid in South Africa, a story of pain and perseverance, of truth and reconciliation, of one man's courage and a nation's rebirth. Because in the end, it was not the power of guns or laws that won. It was the power of forgiveness, and that power, once awakened, can change the world. If stories like this move you, if history reminds you of the strength within humanity, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Join us as we uncover more moments that change the world one story at a time.